The letter had described a woman of 22, light-haired and cheerful, the kind of bride that made a man picture Sunday mornings and wildflower bouquets. But the woman who stepped off the stage in Caldwell, Kansas on a Tuesday afternoon in the spring of 1878 was none of those things. And Hugh Wallace stood at the edge of the dusty road with his hat in his hands and felt the ground shift beneath his boots in a way that had nothing to do with the earth. She was perhaps 34, maybe 35, with dark hair threaded through with the first quiet suggestions of silver at her temples, and she moved with a deliberateness that spoke not of age, but of a woman who had learned the cost of hurrying. Her dress was a deep blue-gray, practical and well-kept, and she carried a single leather satchel in one hand and a carpet-bag in the other, and she did not look around the street the way nervous brides did, with wide eyes and trembling lips. She simply looked, steady and careful, and when her gaze found Hugh standing at the far edge of the road, she met it without flinching. Hugh Wallace was 38 years old. He had been a cattle driver for most of his adult life, and had bought his parcel of land outside Caldwell 4 years prior with money earned through long drives up from Texas, through drought and river crossings, and the particular loneliness of the open range. He had written the letter to a matrimonial agency in St. Louis because his neighbor, Frank Deering, had done the same thing and now had a wife who made biscuits every morning and sang while she hung the washing. And Hugh had lain awake one too many nights listening to the wind press against his single window, and decided that even a man who was comfortable with silence needed someone to share it with. The agency had sent him a letter of introduction for one Miss Clara Holt, age 22, of Springfield, Missouri, whose interests were listed as sewing and letter writing, and who was described as cheerful and adaptable to frontier conditions. Hugh had written back a careful, honest letter about the ranch, about the work involved, about what he could offer and what he could not, and he had waited 4 months for the reply that said Miss Holt would be arriving on the April stage. The woman who descended from that stage was not Miss Clara Holt. Hugh took 2 steps forward and stopped. The woman set down her carpet-bag and straightened, and he could see now that her eyes were a dark, clear hazel, and that there was a steadiness in her face that he found immediately more interesting than anything he had imagined about the cheerful 22-year-old from Springfield. "I am looking for a Mr. Hugh Wallace," she said. Her voice was unhurried and clear, with a slight Missouri cadence beneath it. "That's me," Hugh said. He turned his hat once in his hands. "And you are?" "Rebecca Whitaker," she said. "I owe you an explanation before anything else, and I intend to give you one honestly." Hugh looked at her for a moment. Behind her, the stage driver was pulling down trunks and bags, and the street of Caldwell moved around them in its ordinary afternoon business, horses and commerce and the sound of a hammer from somewhere down the block. He nodded once. "The hotel on the corner has a sitting room," he said, "if you'd like to sit down." "I would appreciate that," she said, and she picked up her carpet-bag again before he could offer to take it. He took the satchel anyway, and she let him, and they walked side by side down the wooden boardwalk without speaking, which Hugh found surprisingly comfortable. The sitting room of the Caldwell Hotel was a modest space with 4 chairs arranged near a window that looked out onto the main street, and a young woman behind the front desk pretended very hard not to watch them as they settled into 2 of the chairs facing each other. Hugh set her satchel on the floor between them and folded his hat onto his knee, and Rebecca Whitaker folded her hands in her lap and looked at him directly. "Clara Holt is my niece," she said. "She is 22 years old and she is sweet and she cannot come west." "Why not?" Hugh asked, not with anger. He was genuinely curious. "Because 3 weeks before she was to board the stage, she fell in love with a schoolteacher in Springfield," Rebecca said. "A perfectly good man as far as I can judge, and she wrote to the agency to withdraw, but she also wrote to me because she felt terrible about the inconvenience to you, and she paused, and for just a moment something shifted in her face, some brief private wait. "I was already planning to come west," she finished. "I have a reason to be in Kansas that has nothing to do with matrimonial arrangements. but Clara begged me to at least come and explain in person, so you would not be left standing at the stage with no word and no understanding of what had happened." "That was considerate of her," Hugh said. He studied Rebecca's face. "And considerate of you. It seemed the least that was owed to you," she said. "You wrote an honest letter. You deserved an honest explanation. May I ask what brings you to Kansas otherwise?" She looked out the window for a moment. A wagon rolled past, raising a small cloud of dust. "My brother-in-law has a farm outside of town," she said. "My sister died in February. I'm coming to help him manage the children and the property until he finds his footing again." "I'm sorry about your sister," Hugh said. She looked back at him, and the steadiness in her face did not crack, but something behind her eyes acknowledged the condolence with more feeling than a polite nod would have suggested. "Thank you," she said quietly. They sat for a moment in a silence that was not uncomfortable. "Do you need any assistance getting to your brother-in-law's farm?" Hugh asked. "I know the land outside Caldwell. I could point you to a wagon hire, or if it's within a few miles, I could drive you out myself." "That is very kind," she said. "His name is Martin Fowler. I believe his farm is some 7 miles northeast of town." Hugh nodded. "I know where the Fowler place is. I've driven cattle past that road a dozen times. I can take you this afternoon if you'd like, or tomorrow morning. Whatever suits you." Rebecca looked at him with a careful, measuring quality, not suspicious but thoughtful, as though she was reading something more in the offer than simple courtesy. "You're not angry," she said. It was not quite a question. "No," Hugh said. He thought about it for a moment before he continued, because he was not a man given to careless speech. "I won't pretend I'm not disappointed. I've been looking forward to the idea of company, of building something with someone. But I can't hold it against you that your niece found love where she found it, or against her either. That's how these things work sometimes." "Most men would be furious," Rebecca said. "You've lost 4 months of waiting and a trip to the stage for a bride who did not come." "I've lost 4 months of hoping," he said. "But I still have the ranch and the spring work is starting, and I suppose that's what there is to do." He looked out the window himself for a moment, then back at her. "I appreciate you coming to explain it in person. That took something." "It seemed right," she said simply. He drove her out to the Fowler farm that afternoon in his wagon, with her 2 bags in the back and the late April sun lying long and warm across the Kansas grasslands. The land was extraordinary that time of year, when the winter had loosened its grip, and the prairie grasses were coming up tender and new, pale green and silver gold in the slanted light, and the sky above was the kind of blue that seemed to go back forever. Rebecca sat on the wagon seat beside him and looked at it all without speaking for a long while, and Hugh drove and did not feel the need to fill the silence with words. "It's bigger than I imagined," she said finally. "The sky. It takes some adjusting to," he said. "Does it ever stop affecting you?" He considered the question honestly. "No," he said. "I've been out here 6 years and it still does something to me every morning." She looked at him sideways, just briefly, and then back at the horizon. They found the Fowler place as the light was going golden, a clapboard farmhouse set back from a dirt road with a barn in reasonable repair and a kitchen garden beginning to push through the turned earth beside the house. 3 children were playing in the yard, a boy of perhaps 10 and 2 younger girls, and they stopped their game and stared at the approaching wagon with the frank curiosity of children who had not yet learned to pretend otherwise. Martin Fowler came to the door when he heard the wagon, and he was a lean man of perhaps 40 with tired eyes and the particular careful blankness of a man who was managing grief by not stopping moving. His face changed when he saw Rebecca, and in that change Hugh saw the whole of it, the relief and the loss and the gratitude all mixed together, and he felt he was witnessing something private enough that he kept his eyes on the horses while Fowler came down the porch steps and Rebecca climbed down from the wagon. "Becca," Fowler said, and his voice cracked on the name. "I'm here, Martin," she said, and she put her hand on his arm, and that was all. Hugh unloaded her bags and set them on the porch, and Fowler shook his hand and thanked him with the rough courtesy of a man who did not have spare energy for social grace, but knew what it was worth. Hugh told him it was no trouble and turned the wagon around. And as he did, he looked back once and saw Rebecca Whitaker standing in the yard with the 10-year-old boy already at her side, talking to her with earnest animation. And she was listening to him with the same steady, complete attention she had given to Hugh himself in the hotel sitting room. And something about that pressed against the inside of Hugh's chest in a way he could not quite account for. He drove back toward Caldwell in the darkening evening and told himself it was nothing, just the particular melancholy of a man who had expected a wife and received instead an afternoon of honest conversation and prairie light, and he should count himself lucky for the conversation and let the rest of it go. He was back at the Fowler farm 6 days later with no particular plan. He told himself, driving out, that he was bringing the extra seedling potatoes that Frank Deering had pressed on him after the spring planting because Frank always grew more than he needed, and the Fowler place had looked like it could use the addition to the kitchen garden. This was true. It was also true that he had thought about Rebecca Whitaker every morning when he woke up and several times during the day, which was less easy to explain with potatoes. She was in the kitchen garden when he pulled up, crouched between the rows with her sleeves rolled to her elbows and her dark hair pinned up with the practical efficiency of a woman who was not concerned with being observed. She looked up at the sound of the wagon and shaded her eyes with her forearm. "Mr. Wallace," she said, and there was something in her voice that he chose to read as pleased rather than surprised. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, and then stopped, because he did not know if the title was correct. "Or Miss." "Mrs.," she said, standing and brushing the earth from her hands. "My husband died 4 years ago. I kept the name." "I'm sorry," he said. "So am I," she said, not as a performance of grief but as a simple fact, and he respected that. He brought the potato seedlings around to the garden, and she showed him where she thought they might go best. And they worked together for an hour in the warm morning, turning the earth and setting the plants. And the 10-year-old boy, whose name was Daniel, came out and worked beside them with the focused seriousness of a child who needed to be useful. Hugh showed him how to pack the earth firmly around each seedling so the roots would catch, and Daniel listened with his tongue between his teeth, and Rebecca watched them both from the corner of her eye with an expression Hugh could not read but wanted to. Afterward she brought out water and they sat on the porch steps in the shade of the eave, and she asked him about the ranch with genuine curiosity, not polite inquiry but actual interest, asking specific questions about the cattle work and the land and what the winter had been like. And Hugh found himself talking more freely than he usually did, because most people asked about the ranch to be courteous, and she asked about it because she actually wanted to know. "What kind of cattle?" she asked. "Longhorns mostly, from the Texas drives," he said. "I've been crossing them with some Herefords over the last 2 years. The Herefords put on more beef and they're easier on the land. The Longhorns are tough but they're lean." "And which do you prefer?" he considered. "The Longhorns," he admitted. "They're difficult and they're ornery and they'll test your patience every single day, but there's something honest about them. They don't pretend to be anything other than what they are." She looked at him with something that might have been amusement. "That does sound like a recommendation," she said. "It might be," he said, and he looked at her over the rim of his cup, and something passed between them that was brief and bright and immediately tucked away by both of them, because they were careful people. He came back the following Wednesday. He had a reason that time, too. A broken fence line that ran along the property boundary between the Fowler land and a stretch of road that technically required both parties to maintain. And he had the wire and the tools and the time. And Martin Fowler was a man with too much to do and not enough hands. Martin was grateful and said so straightforwardly. And Hugh worked on the fence all morning while Martin plowed the north field. And when midday came, Rebecca brought out bread and cold salt pork, and a jar of pickled vegetables that she had evidently made herself from last year's stores, and the 3 of them ate in the shade of the elm tree near the fence line. Martin Fowler was not a complicated man. He was grief-worn and tired and deeply grateful for his sister-in-law, and he watched Rebecca and Hugh with eyes that noticed things even if he was too occupied to remark on them. He talked about Clara's plans and about the spring planting and about Daniel's schooling, and Hugh listened and contributed, and Rebecca sat cross-legged on the grass with her shoes set neatly to one side and ate her bread and was quietly, completely present in the way she always seemed to be. After Martin went back to the field, they walked along the repaired fence line together, checking the tension of the wire, and Hugh said, without particularly planning to, "I've been thinking about what you said, about coming west to explain things in person." "What about it?" she asked. "It was a generous thing to do for a stranger, and it couldn't have been easy given what else you were coming to." She was quiet for a moment, stepping over a tussock of grass. "Grief doesn't stop the world requiring things of you," she said. "If anything, it makes the practical obligations clearer. Someone had to come to help Martin. I needed somewhere to go. Clara was worried about you. It all arranged itself into one trip. But you were the one who made the trip," he said. "Someone has to actually do the thing." She looked at him sideways. "Are you complimenting me, Mr. Wallace?" "I might be," he said. The echo of their earlier conversation was entirely deliberate, and she heard it because the corner of her mouth moved. "Then I'll take it as one," she said. He drove home that afternoon with the late light on the grass, and the feeling that the world had shifted slightly on its axis. Not dramatically, not with the violence of a thing being broken and remade, but with the quiet, serious movement of something settling into a better position. He came back the next Wednesday, and the one after that, until it was simply understood that Hugh Wallace would appear at the Fowler farm on Wednesday mornings, and would bring something useful and stay through midday and sometimes into the afternoon, and that this was a welcome arrangement for everyone involved. In late May, a trouble came. There was a man named Cord Haggerty who ran cattle on a large spread north of Caldwell, and who had disputed the boundary of the Fowler land for the better part of 2 years, claiming a strip of the eastern pasture as his own. Martin had documentation showing otherwise, but Haggerty was a man who solved disputes with persistence and volume rather than evidence. And now that Martin was alone with 3 children and grief and a full spring workload, Haggerty had apparently decided this was the time to press his claim more aggressively. Hugh arrived on a Wednesday morning in late May to find Martin Fowler standing on his porch with a tight jaw and a letter in his hand, and Rebecca standing beside him with her arms folded, and her expression the careful, compressed sort that Hugh had come to understand meant she was genuinely angry and was choosing not to show the full extent of it. "Haggerty's man delivered this yesterday," Martin said, handing Hugh the letter. Hugh read it. It was a formal notice, written in the hand of someone who had probably been told by Haggerty what to say but had enough legal education to make it sound official, claiming that the eastern pasture was rightfully Haggerty's property, and demanding that Fowler remove his fence within 30 days or face appropriate action, which was deliberately left undefined. "His claim isn't valid," Hugh said, handing the letter back. "I know the land registry for this area. The Fowler homestead was filed in 1873, and it includes that eastern pasture clear to the creek." "I know that," Martin said. "But Haggerty doesn't seem to care what the registry says." "Then we take the registry to someone who can enforce it," Hugh said. "The county sheriff is Dalton Meeks," Martin said, with a flatness that explained everything. "He and Haggerty play cards together on Friday nights." Rebecca spoke then, quietly but with a precision that made both men look at her. "There is a federal land office in Wichita," she said. "The registry there supersedes county enforcement. If we have documentation of the original filing, we can send a formal appeal to Wichita and request that a federal agent review the boundary." Both men looked at her. "My husband dealt with a similar situation in Missouri," she said, by way of explanation. "It took 4 months, but the federal record held and the neighbor backed down. You'd know what documentation to put together," Hugh asked. "I'd know exactly what to put together," she said. Hugh looked at Martin. Martin looked back at him with something that was close to the first real relief Hugh had seen on the man's face in 6 weeks. "Then let's put it together," Hugh said. They spent that afternoon at the kitchen table, Rebecca organizing Martin's papers with a methodical efficiency that was something to watch, sorting homestead filings and survey records, and the original deed by date and type, writing a clear summary letter in her precise, readable hand that laid out the history of the claim, and cited the relevant land regulations that Hugh knew from memory, because he had dealt with boundary questions on his own property. By the time the evening light was going long across the floor, they had a complete package ready to send to Wichita, and Martin had gone out to do the evening milking with his children, and Hugh and Rebecca were alone at the kitchen table with the papers between them and the oil lamp lit against the gathering dusk. "That was well done," Hugh said, looking at the finished letter. "It's just organization," she said, but she was pleased, he could tell. She blotted the last page and said it with the others. "It's more than that," he said. "Knowing what to ask for and how to ask for it in the right order through the right channels. A lot of people know what they want but not how to go about getting it properly." She looked up at him. The lamp made the hazel of her eyes warmer, more amber at the center. "That may be the most useful compliment anyone has given me in quite some time," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. The house was quiet around them, the children's voices gone outside with Martin, and it struck Hugh suddenly how entirely natural it was to be sitting across from her at this kitchen table in the evening light, how little effort it took to be near her, how the space between them felt comfortable and complicated at the same time, which was a combination he had not expected to find again in his life. "Rebecca," he said, and her name in his mouth felt important. She did not look away. "Hugh," she said the same way. "I would like to call on you properly," he said, "not for fencing or potato seedlings." The corner of her mouth moved. "I thought you'd never mention it," she said. He rode home that night under a full May moon with the prairie spread silver and dark around him, and the horses moving easy on the familiar road. And he felt something that was not quite happiness yet, but was the warm, tentative precursor to it. The way the sky goes pale before the sun actually rises, that held breath moment before the light comes. The letter to Wichita went out the next morning with the eastbound stage, and Hugh began calling on Rebecca every Sunday afternoon in addition to his Wednesday work visits, which were not called courtship, but were understood by everyone involved to be exactly that. He would come in the afternoon with a small offering, once a paper of sugar, once a new candle, once a book he thought she might find interesting, a surveyor's account of the Kansas territory that he had been keeping on his shelf for 2 years, and had never gotten around to reading but thought she would get more from than he had. And she always received the offerings with the same quiet, direct pleasure that was better than theatrical gratitude. They walked in the evenings when the light was long, down the Fowler Lane and back, and they talked. They talked about her husband, a printer named James Whitaker, who had been a good and kind man, and had died of a fever when Rebecca was 30. Leaving her with no children and a print shop, she had run herself for 2 years before selling it, and going to live with her sister in Springfield. They talked about Hugh's years on the cattle drives, the great open movements of men and animals across the plains, the beauty and violence and tedium of it, the particular quality of friendship forged by shared hard work and shared sky. They talked about books, both of them having read more than their circumstances might have suggested, and they disagreed vigorously about the relative merits of 2 different accounts of frontier life, which led to a discussion that lasted 3 Sundays and ended only because they both conceded the other had valid points. Daniel Fowler had decided with the absolute certainty of a 10-year-old that Hugh Wallace was the finest man he had ever encountered, largely on the basis of Hugh's knowledge of cattle and his willingness to explain things at length, and with real answers rather than simplified ones. He would appear at Hugh's elbow whenever possible and ask questions about rope work and horse training and the mechanics of wells, and Hugh answered all of them with the same patient honesty he brought to everything. And Rebecca watched this from whatever she was doing and felt something in her chest that was both sweet and a little painful, the way bittersweet things always are. In June, the word came back from Wichita. A federal land agent named Augustus Cole would be visiting Caldwell in July to review the boundary dispute. Haggerty had apparently received notice of the inquiry and had responded through an attorney of his own, which meant the matter was now official enough that the county sheriff's social calendar with Haggerty would not be a factor. Martin Fowler read the letter twice, standing at the kitchen table, and then put it down and pressed his hand over his eyes for a moment, and when he took his hand away his face had the particular unguarded quality of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has just been told he can set it down. "Thank you," he said to Rebecca, and then to Hugh, and then just to the room in general, which included both of them. "Thank Rebecca," Hugh said. "She knew the channel to use." "I knew the channel because you knew the land registry," Rebecca said. "It was both of us." Martin looked at the two of them with the expression of a man who had noticed something very obvious and was choosing not to say anything about it for his own private reasons, and he went out to feed the horses. July was hot and gold and green, and the prairie shimmered in the afternoon heat, and Hugh came every Sunday and most Wednesdays, and the calls had become longer and less formal, so that now he might sit on the porch with Rebecca in the evening after the children were inside, and they would watch the stars come out over the flat horizon one by one, and talk or not talk as the mood took them. One evening in late July, she told him about the last months of her sister Eleanor's life, the gradual losing of ground and the effort to be cheerful for the children and Martin, the particular loneliness of watching someone you love diminish. She told it quietly and without performance, looking at the darkening sky, and Hugh listened without interrupting or offering comfort until she was finished, and then he said, "She sounds like she was someone worth knowing." "She was the best person I have ever known," Rebecca said. "I was always the practical one. She was the one who made everything feel like it had color." "I think you have more color than you give yourself credit for," Hugh said. She looked at him. "I mean it," he said. He was not a man who said things he did not mean. You're not what I expected," which I know is an odd thing to say since you came instead of someone else. "It is a rather odd compliment, yes," she said, but she was not dismissing it. She was turning it over. "What I mean is," he said carefully, "that I wrote a letter to an agency because I wanted company, because I wanted someone to build something with. And then you came and I found out immediately that you were not what I'd been told to expect, and I have not thought about what I was told to expect once since that afternoon in the hotel sitting room. Not once." The silence that followed was full and warm, the way the air was full and warm, the night insects singing in the grass around the house. "I did not come to Kansas to be anyone's wife," Rebecca said, not as a refusal but as a piece of honesty she felt she owed him. "I came to look after Eleanor's children and make sure Martin didn't drown in his grief and his spring planting. I came because I was needed and because I had nowhere else where I was needed quite so specifically." "I know," Hugh said. "I'm not asking you to change why you came." She was quiet. An owl called somewhere in the elm stand to the north. "What are you asking?" She said. He looked at her in the dim light. "I'm asking if you might consider that needing to be somewhere and wanting to be somewhere could eventually be the same place," he said. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that the silence might have been an answer in itself. But she did not go inside, and she did not look away from him, and when she finally spoke her voice was low and careful and entirely honest. "I think I might be willing to consider that," she said. Augustus Cole, the federal land agent, arrived in Caldwell on a morning in late July. A compact, efficient man in a brown suit who smelled of train smoke and carried a leather satchel full of survey maps and registry documents. He met with Martin Fowler and Hugh Wallace and Cord Haggerty and his attorney in the back room of the land office on the main street, and he spread his maps on the table and consulted his registry records and asked precise, brief questions. Haggerty was a broad, loud man in his 50s with a red face and the habit of speaking over other people, and he did this twice in Cole's presence before the federal agent looked at him with a flatness so complete and unimpressed that even Haggerty understood it was time to be quiet. Cole examined the original Fowler homestead filing, the survey boundary markers, the land registry entries, and the summary document that Rebecca had prepared, which Cole read twice without expression, and then set aside with the paper face down, which in Hugh's experience usually meant a document had been found to be organized well enough to require no further review. The determination took 3 days and came in writing. The eastern pasture belonged to the Fowler homestead as originally filed. Haggerty's claim was without merit. He was to make no further action regarding the boundary under threat of federal sanction. Haggerty was furious, which expressed itself as a great deal of noise in Caldwell's Main Street saloon, and then, when no one came to be outraged on his behalf, a gradual, sullen acceptance. He was a man who preyed on weakness, and the Fowler land was no longer weak. Martin Fowler shook Hugh's hand so hard and for so long outside the land office that it was almost funny, and then he went home to tell his children, and Hugh went to tell Rebecca. She was in the kitchen garden when he pulled up, the same as the first time he had come back, crouched between the rows, and she stood when she heard his wagon and shaded her eyes, and he could see from 20 feet away that she knew from his face that the news was good. Cole ruled for Martin, he said, climbing down. She put her hand over her mouth for just a moment and then took it away, and she was not crying, but her eyes were brilliant with something very close to it. It held, she said. It held, he said. Clean and complete, Haggerty has nothing left to push with. She crossed the distance between them and took both his hands in hers, and it was the first time they had touched with intention rather than accident, and they both felt the weight of it. Her hands were garden-warm and strong, and his were work-rough and large around hers, and they stood in the kitchen garden in the afternoon sun with her hands in his and the relief and the happiness of it moving between them like a current. "We did something real," she said. "Together." "We did," he said. He looked down at their joined hands and then up at her face. "Rebecca, Hugh," she said. He had kissed her before he quite decided to, which was unusual for him because he was a man who decided things deliberately. But she kissed him back immediately and without hesitation, which told him the decision had been made by both of them already at some point in the conversation, and neither of them had announced it yet. The kiss was brief and warm and entirely serious, the way they both were, and when they separated she was looking at him with clear eyes and a very small smile, and he felt something in him open up that had been closed for a very long time. "Well," she said. "Yes," he said. "You should probably say something proper," she said. "I will," he said. "I intend to. But I wanted to do that first." She laughed, and it was the first real full laugh he had heard from her, not the small restrained amusement she allowed herself, but a genuine laugh, and it was the best sound he had heard in years. He did say something proper that evening, on the porch after supper, with Martin inside doing the dishes because he had absolutely engineered the situation by inventing a reason to be elsewhere, and Daniel sitting on the porch railing 5 feet away pretending to look at a hawk, until Rebecca told him clearly that this was a private conversation, and he should go help his father. And Daniel went, very slowly, backward toward the door, watching them with the unsubtle curiosity of a 10-year-old. "I don't have a ring yet," Hugh said. "I want to be clear that this is a sincere offer even without the ring." "I am entirely clear on that," Rebecca said. He had thought about what to say for 3 weeks and had concluded that any prepared speech would sound like a prepared speech, and what Rebecca Whitaker deserved was honesty and specificity. "I am 38 years old," he said. "I have a ranch with 200 acres and 112 cattle, and a house that needs more work than I've given it. I work hard, and I am not always easy company, and I have opinions about cattle breeding that I have been told are excessive. I will not pretend the frontier is comfortable, because you already know it isn't. What I can offer you is genuine partnership, not a woman to take care of the house while I take care of the cattle, but someone to build something with side by side. And I want it to be you, not because you came when someone else could not, because you are who you are. Rebecca was quiet for a long moment. The evening was soft around them, the grasses moving in the warm wind, the first fireflies beginning their slow pulse in the darkness near the creek. "I am 34 years old," she said. "I have been a widow for 4 years and a grieving sister for 6 months, and I came to Kansas to look after other people's lives, which I am good at, but I think I would like to build a life of my own. I am not a young woman, and I am not an easy woman, and I have opinions about how things should be organized and done that I have been told are also excessive." She paused. "I think our opinions might be compatible," she said. "I think you are the most genuinely good man I have met in a very long time, and I would be proud to be the woman beside you." "Is that a yes?" he said. "It is a very particular and very sincere yes," she said. He took her hand again, and they sat with the prairie evening around them, and neither of them said anything for a while, because neither of them needed to. Martin Fowler, when told, was so transparently relieved and pleased that he shook Hugh's hand again with the same force as before, and then hugged Rebecca so hard she made a small sound of protest, and his eyes were wet around the edges when he stepped back, which he covered by looking at the ceiling and clearing his throat. "Eleanor would have liked you," he told Hugh. "She always said Becca needed someone who wasn't intimidated by her." "I'm not intimidated by her," Hugh said. "I'm impressed by her." "That," Martin said, "is exactly what I meant." They planned for a fall wedding September, which gave them 2 months, and which felt to both of them like the right amount of time, not rushed, not delayed, just sufficient. Hugh began the work on his house that he had been putting off, not because it had been good enough before, but because there had been no one to build it for. He added a second room to the south side, framed in new windows, and relaid the boards of the main floor where they had warped, and built a proper kitchen shelf, because the one he had was a single plank across 2 brackets that had been fine for a man alone, and would not be fine for a woman who knew how to cook properly. Rebecca came to see the house in August, the first time she had been there, and she walked through it with the same careful attention she gave to everything, taking in the space and the light and the particular quality of the silence, which was different from the Fowler Farm's silence, wider and more solitary, and full of the sound of the open range beyond the fence. She stood at the window of the new room and looked out at the prairie going gold and brown in the August heat, the grass long and moving in the dry wind, and she said, "It's a good house." "It will be better," he said. "It's already good," she said. She turned around and looked at him standing in the doorway, and her expression was full of something warm and private. "I can see living here," she said. "I hope so," he said. "That is very much the idea." She smiled at him. "Show me the cattle," she said. He did. He walked her along the fence line of the south pasture, and she asked questions he had not expected, about feed and water and the progression of the crossbreeding, and he answered all of them, and she nodded with the focused engagement of someone who was actually learning something they intended to use, not just being polite. "The Herefords are more compact," she said, looking at a group of cattle across the fence. "Yes. They put on weight more efficiently. But the Longhorns have character," she said. He looked at her. She was looking at a particular rangy Longhorn steer who was looking back at them with the belligerent dignity of a creature who considered himself to be the real owner of the property. "They do," Hugh said. "I like them," she said. "The difficult ones always have more to them." He thought that was the finest thing anyone had ever said about his cattle. In late August, 2 weeks before the wedding, a new complication arrived in the form of a letter from the matrimonial agency in St. Louis. It had apparently taken this long for Hugh's original query to be fully processed through the agency's records, and the letter was a formal inquiry about whether the arrangement with Miss Clara Holt had proceeded satisfactorily. There was an enclosed note from Clara herself, written in a young woman's rounded hand, full of apologies and joy about her schoolteacher, and a long, earnest paragraph about Aunt Rebecca, whom she described as the best woman in Missouri and who Clara hoped had arrived safely. Hugh read the letter at his kitchen table on a Thursday morning and then rode out to show it to Rebecca, who read Clara's note 3 times and then put it down and pressed her fingers against her mouth for a moment. "She's happy," Rebecca said. "She sounds it," Hugh said, "and she's clearly very fond of you." "She was always a good child," Rebecca said. "She always had enough heart to feel responsible for things that were not quite her fault." She looked at the note again, folded it carefully, and looked up at Hugh. "I should write and tell her how it turned out." "Yes," Hugh said. "She'll be very glad to know." "I think she may feel somewhat responsible for it," Rebecca said, in a pleased way. "She'd probably be right to," Hugh said. "If she hadn't needed someone to come explain things, you'd have stayed in Missouri and I'd still be mending fences by myself." "You'd have gotten another letter from the agency," Rebecca said. "I'd have thrown it out," he said. She looked at him. "I'm serious," he said. "There is no version of how this could have gone that I would prefer to this one." She was quiet for a moment. In the particular way she was quiet when something had moved her, and she was deciding how much of that to show. "Neither would I," she said. The wedding was on a Saturday in the second week of September, 1878. In the parlor of the Fowler house, with a minister who came out from Caldwell on a borrowed horse, and who was a practical man of God with a preference for short ceremonies and genuine meaning over lengthy ones with decorative feeling. Frank Deering and his wife, whose name was Louise, and who had befriended Rebecca with the wholehearted enthusiasm of a woman who had been the only other married woman on her particular stretch of the frontier for 3 years, stood as witnesses. The Fowler children were present, Daniel in his best shirt and the 2 younger girls, Margaret and Anne, who were 5 and 7, in matching dresses that Rebecca had made for them during the summer. They sat in a row on the parlor chairs with the focused seriousness of children given a formal occasion, and Daniel watched the ceremony with the expression of a person watching something that had consequences he was not entirely finished calculating. Rebecca wore a dress the color of late summer grasses, a warm brownish gold, because she was a practical woman, and a woman of practicality in 1878 on the Kansas frontier did not have a white dress made for one occasion, and because the color suited her in a way that Hugh noticed the moment she came down the stairs with Martin at her elbow. He had not expected to feel the way he felt when he saw her. He had expected to feel pleased, confirmed, steady, all of which he felt. He had not expected the particular bright quality of it, the way everything in his field of vision narrowed down to her coming across the parlor toward him, unhurried, direct, certain. He had not expected to feel like the luckiest man in Kansas. The minister read the words and they said their parts, and when Hugh put the ring on her finger, which was a plain gold band he had ordered from the jeweler in Caldwell 3 weeks earlier, and which fit exactly because Rebecca had measured her own finger with string and given him the measurement without being asked. Because she was Rebecca, she looked at it for a moment and then up at him, and her expression was everything he had hoped to see there. They drove back to the ranch in the evening, man and wife, the wagon loaded with the practical goods of a joined household, the kitchen things Rebecca had accumulated at the Fowler farm, her books, her small box of personal items, and the rug from the Fowler parlor that Martin had pressed on her because she had admired it once, and because Martin Fowler was a man who repaid generosity however he could. The prairie was doing what it did in September, turning all its gold and amber tones deep in the evening light, the grasses moving in long, slow waves, and the sky going from blue to rose to the deep violet of approaching night. Rebecca sat beside Hugh on the wagon seat with her arm against his, and he was aware of her warmth and her solid, specific presence the way you are aware of a fire in a cold room, not because it is extraordinary but because it is exactly what was needed. "Here we are," he said, when the ranch house came in sight. "Here we are," she said. She looked at it in the dying light, the low whitewashed walls and the new south room and the fenced lines going out across the dark grass. "It already looks like home," she said. "It is home," he said. She looked at him. "For both of us," she said, with a deliberateness that made it clear she meant it as a statement of fact and not a question. "For both of us," he agreed, and turned the horses in through the gate. The first winter of their marriage was a hard one, as Kansas winters generally were, with the wind coming off the plains with a force that felt personal, and the temperature dropping to depths that made every chore a negotiation with the elements. But the house was warm, because Hugh had insulated it carefully, and because Rebecca had filled every gap and crack and draft point with practical efficiency in the first week of October before the cold came, and the cattle came through the worst of it with fewer losses than Hugh had expected. They worked well together. This was not nothing. Two people can love each other very sincerely and still be unable to share a house and a workload without friction. But Hugh and Rebecca had both been adults for long enough to know their own habits and be capable of adjusting them, and they had both been alone for long enough to genuinely appreciate the daily fact of another person. She took to the ranch with the same focused engagement she brought to everything, learning the routines and the requirements and the specific character of the animals with a methodical thoroughness that had the cattle hands, when they came for the winter check, looking at her with surprised respect. Hugh had two regular hands, brothers named Seth and Caleb Garrett, young men in their mid-20s from a Texas family, and they had arrived for the late fall work expecting a ranch wife who fed them well and let the men handle things, and had found instead a woman who could discuss the condition of the herd with specific and accurate knowledge, and who had opinions about the Hereford crossbreeding that were, it turned out, fully supported by what they had seen on other properties in Texas. "She's something," Seth told Hugh privately while they were mending fence on the North Line in November. "No offense meant. None taken," Hugh said. "She is. She knows as much about cattle as she acts like she does." "More," Hugh said, without looking up from the wire. Seth was quiet for a moment. "You're a lucky man, Mr. Wallace." "I know it," Hugh said. Rebecca and Louise Deering became genuine friends over that winter, the kind of friendship that forms between intelligent women who have found each other on a stretch of frontier where intelligent women were not always recognized as such by the wider world. Louise was 31 and had two young children, and had come west from Ohio with Frank, and had never quite stopped being surprised by Kansas, in both the best and worst ways. And she and Rebecca would visit back and forth with a regularity that required some planning given the distance between the properties. And they would sit in whoever's kitchen and talk with the honest, direct engagement of two women who did not have to perform for each other. Louise came over in December with her children and some canned goods, and the news that she was expecting a third child, and Rebecca embraced her with great warmth, and they spent the afternoon talking about the practical aspects of pregnancy on the frontier, which was a conversation that would have been impossible with most men present, but which Hugh, coming in from the barn in time to hear the last 20 minutes of it, participated in with such matter-of-fact good sense that Louise went home and told Frank that Hugh Wallace was a most unusual man. Christmas that year was a quiet celebration, as it properly should have been, with no church closer than Caldwell, but with the particular richness that a winter interior has when it is full of firelight and the smell of food, and two people who have found their rhythm together. Hugh had made Rebecca a practical gift, a proper writing desk, small and well-proportioned, fitted to the corner of the south room where she had her books and papers, because she wrote to her brother-in-law and her niece, and 2 or 3 other correspondents with a regularity that suggested correspondence was important to her, and she had been doing it at the kitchen table, which was inconvenient for everyone. She had made him, in turn, a quilt, not the decorative kind but a working quilt, thick and warm and pieced together from wool scraps in colors that were deep and serious, navy and brown, and the dark red of dried autumn grasses. She had been working on it since October in the evenings when she thought he was not watching, and he had been watching and had not said anything, which she found out when he thanked her for it, and mentioned the evening in November when she had been piecing the center medallion, and the lamp had made her face look like a painting. "You were watching," she said, not accusingly. "I like watching you work," he said. "You have a very particular face when you're concentrating." "What sort of face?" she said, folding the quilt over her lap. "Satisfied," he said, "like everything makes sense when you're in the middle of doing it properly." She was quiet for a moment. "That is exactly how it feels," she said. "How did you know?" "I recognize it," he said. "It's how I feel with the cattle." She smiled at him, and it was the wide, genuine smile that he had earned gradually over the months of their courtship, and which still felt like a specific reward every time he saw it fully. In February, Rebecca told Hugh she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning before breakfast, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands around her cup and a look on her face that was composed and careful and full of something that he could see was trying to decide whether it was allowed to be fully happy. He sat down across from her and did not say anything for a moment, just looked at her, and then he said, "How are you feeling?" "Uncertain," she said. "I am 35 years old. I did not expect," she stopped. "James and I never had children. I had assumed it was simply not to be." And now she looked at him across the table. "I do not want you to be worried about me," she said. "I am strong and I am sensible and I know what care to take." "I'll be worried about you regardless," he said. "That's not a thing you can prevent." The corner of her mouth moved. "No," she said, "I don't suppose it is." "Are you happy?" he asked. She looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said, and it was quiet and certain and entirely true. "I think I am so happy about it that I am frightened to say so." "Then I'll say it," he said. "I am very happy about it." She took his hand across the table, and he held it, and that was all that was needed. He drove her into Caldwell to see the doctor in March, a capable man named Dr. Samuel Horton, who had come west from Pennsylvania 3 years earlier, and who treated his frontier patients with the same standard of care he would have given them in the East, which was not always the case with frontier doctors. He examined Rebecca and confirmed the pregnancy, and told Hugh that his wife was in excellent health, and that there was no reason to anticipate difficulty, and that he expected the child in late August or early September. Rebecca took the news home and wrote letters to Martin Fowler and to Clara Holt, who was by now Clara Morrison, and living in Springfield with her schoolteacher husband, and expecting her own first child in the summer. Clara's reply arrived 3 weeks later, 6 excited pages in her rounded hand, and Rebecca read it at her writing desk with a smile that she did not try to hide. Spring of 1879 came warm and early, and with it the full resumption of the ranch work, and Rebecca stayed active in it well into June, because she was not a woman who sat still for discomfort, and because there was work to be done and she was capable of doing it. Hugh fretted carefully, which was to say he fretted in a manner that was attentive without being smothering, because he had learned by now that Rebecca's independence was not a thing to be worked around but a thing to be respected, and that the way to take care of her was to make things available rather than to insist on her using them. He hired a third hand for the summer months, a capable woman named Rosa Torres, whose family had been in Kansas since before the territory was settled, whose husband worked the Deering spread, and who came to the Wallace ranch 3 days a week to help with the heavier household work. Rosa was 29 and sharp and practical, and she and Rebecca developed within 2 weeks the kind of direct, respectful working relationship that serves women well on the frontier, built on shared competence and the mutual recognition of it. The summer was long and full of work and the particular richness of a life that is genuinely being built, not just maintained. The cattle were doing well, the crossbreeding showing results that Hugh noted with quiet satisfaction, and which Seth and Caleb Garrett confirmed was on the right track when they came back for the summer work. The fences were in good order. The kitchen garden, which Rebecca had expanded substantially in the spring, was producing generously. Martin Fowler came with his children for a Sunday visit in July, and Daniel, now 11, was noticeably taller and more contained in his sorrow, the way children are when the first raw year has passed and life has begun to coax them back into it. He sat with Hugh after dinner and asked questions about the cattle with the same intense focus as always, and Hugh noticed that the questions were more sophisticated than they had been a year ago, showing real accumulated knowledge. "You've been reading," Hugh said. "Aunt Becca sends me books," Daniel said, "about livestock and farming. She says if I'm going to live on a farm, I should understand the science of it." "She's right," Hugh said. "Is that your philosophy too?" Daniel asked with a directness that was very like Rebecca. "It is," Hugh said. "The work goes better when you understand what you're working with." Daniel nodded with great seriousness. "I've decided I want to raise horses," he said, "when I'm grown." "That's a good life if you can build it," Hugh said. "Come out again before school starts, and I'll show you what we do with the horses here." Daniel's face lit up in the uncomplicated way that children's faces do when something they want is actually offered to them, and Hugh felt the warmth of it the way you feel the warmth of a fire, directly and without needing to think about it. The child was born on the 31st of August, a boy, arriving with the particular purposeful insistence of a new person who has decided the time has come. Dr. Horton came out from Caldwell and was there when he was needed, and Louise Deering had come 2 days before and stayed, and Rosa Torres was there, and Hugh was very precisely where Rebecca had asked him to be, which was not sent out of the house but present, outside the bedroom door, available. He heard the child cry, and the sound went through him like light through water. When Louise opened the door and told him it was time, he went in, and Rebecca was sitting up in the bed with the child in her arms, and she looked tired beyond description and entirely, completely well, and she looked up at him when he came in with an expression that stripped away everything but the simple fact of what was in the room. "He is very insistent," she said. Her voice was rough, but her eyes were brilliant. Hugh sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, who was red-faced and dark-haired and furious about the general indignity of the world, and who looked, remarkably, already like himself. "What shall we call him?" he said. "I've been thinking about James," she said, "for my husband, but I also—" She paused, looking down at the child. "Would you find it strange if I used both, James for a first name and William for a middle, which was your father's name, if you'd allow it?" Hugh looked at her, and the feeling in his chest was so complete and so large that he had to be still for a moment to hold it. "James William Wallace," he said. "If you like it," she said. "I like it very much," he said. He stayed beside her all through the night, not sleeping, not needing to, just present, with his hand over hers and the child making his small serious sounds, in the cradle that Hugh had made in June, and which Rebecca had lined with a piece of the quilting scraps from the winter quilt, and the house around them full of the particular breathing silence of a place that has become exactly what it was meant to be. In September, he drove Rebecca and James William to the Fowler farm so that Martin and the children could meet the newest member of the extended family, and Margaret and Anne were entirely entranced by the baby in the way that small girls sometimes are. And Daniel inspected James William with the seriousness of a young man who understood he was being asked to feel something and was figuring out whether it was safe to do so, and then declared him acceptable, which made Hugh laugh openly. Martin held the baby with the practiced ease of a man who had held 3 of his own, and looked at Rebecca and Hugh over the small dark head with an expression that was full and quiet and deeply relieved. "Eleanor would have wept," he said. "She always said you deserved this." Rebecca looked at her brother-in-law steadily. "Thank you for saying that," she said. "It's true," Martin said simply. He handed the baby back. The autumn passed in the full, productive way of a season when everything has gone right, the harvests good and the cattle prepared for winter and the house set for the cold months ahead. James William grew with the efficiency of a well-fed baby, and proved to have his mother's eyes and his father's stubborn patience, staring at the world with a focused, serious curiosity that Hugh recognized. He watches, Hugh said one evening, watching his son regard the oil lamp with intense concentration. He learns by watching, Rebecca said. So do you. So do I, Hugh agreed. She was sitting in the lamplight with the baby in her lap, and she had a book open on the table beside her that she had not looked at in 20 minutes because James William kept making the particular faces that made it impossible to look at anything else. The south room had become a proper parlor now, with the rug from the Fowler farm and the writing desk, and a second chair that Hugh had bought in Caldwell. And it was warm and well lit, and full of the specific quality of a home that has been made with intention. Hugh sat in his chair across from her and watched them both in the lamplight and felt so deeply fortunate that it was almost uncomfortable. The way looking at something very bright is almost uncomfortable, but you keep looking anyway. I have been thinking, Rebecca said, without looking up from James William. About what? About the land to the south of the creek, she said. The parcel that belonged to old Harkins before he left. It came up for sale at the land office last week. Seth mentioned it. I heard, Hugh said. He had been thinking about it too. It would give us another 40 acres of bottomland, she said. Better grass than the upland pasture. Room for the Hereford numbers to increase. It would, he said. The price is reasonable. I've been going back and forth on it. She looked up at him. What's the hesitation? It's a stretch. Not impossible, but a stretch. Is it a stretch that becomes manageable in 2 years, given the cattle prices this autumn? He thought about it with the careful honesty he brought to financial questions. Yes, he said. With 2 good years it becomes comfortable. Then it seems worth the stretch, she said, and returned her attention to James William. But it's your decision. It's our decision, he said. She looked up again, and the expression on her face was the same one he had seen in the hotel sitting room in Caldwell on an April afternoon nearly 2 years ago, steady and direct and entirely present. Our decision, she agreed. They made the offer on the Harkins land the following week, and it was accepted by return letter. The deed was signed at the Caldwell land office on a November morning, with James William sleeping in his basket at Rebecca's feet, and the clerk watching them both with the benign curiosity of a man who had witnessed many land transactions, and found this one somehow more interesting than usual. The second winter was easier than the first, not because the weather was gentler, but because the house was more fully itself, and because 2 people who have spent a year learning to live together well have a rhythm that insulates them against the external cold. James William was a good-natured baby, and slept with the reliable thoroughness of a child who had decided sleeping was a task worth doing properly, which allowed both his parents full nights more often than they had any right to expect. Hugh read aloud in the evenings sometimes, when Rebecca was nursing the baby or working on something with her hands, reading from one of the books they had argued about in the summer of the courtship, or from the newspapers that came on the stage from Wichita and were generally 2 weeks old but contained the world regardless. Rebecca would correct him when he mispronounced something, and he would argue that his pronunciation was defensible, and she would explain precisely why it was not, and the baby would regard this exchange with his serious, watching eyes. Louise Deering had her 3rd child in January, a boy they named Thomas, and Rebecca was one of the women present for that birth, the way Louise had been present for hers, which was the way these things worked on the frontier, women making themselves available to each other across the distance, because there was no other kind of help to be had. Frank Deering held his new son with the expression of a man who had expected 2 daughters and a son to feel different, and had found it felt the same, which is to say overwhelming and extraordinary. In the spring of 1880, 2 things happened that shaped the next years of the Wallace Ranch in ways that Hugh had planned for, and Rebecca had in some instances planned for more specifically. The first was the completion of a proper barn, larger than the existing structure, with proper winter stabling for the horses, and covered storage for the hay that had previously required a second, smaller outbuilding. Hugh and Seth and Caleb built it across April and May, and Daniel Fowler came for 2 weeks in May during his school break and worked alongside them with a focused competence that surprised everyone except Rebecca, who had been quietly providing him with technical reading for a year and a half. The second was a letter from the Cattlemen's Association in Wichita, inviting Hugh to speak at their autumn meeting about the Hereford crossbreeding results, which had evidently attracted attention in the wider cattle community. The letter addressed him as a respected member of the Kansas cattle industry, which was a phrase that Hugh read twice and then sat down on the table and looked at the wall for a moment. Rebecca read the letter over his shoulder and then said, "Of course you'll go." "It's 4 days in Wichita," he said. "I'm aware of how long Wichita takes to get to," she said. "I came through it on the way here. You and James William would be alone." "I would not be alone," she said. "I would be here, which is not the same thing as alone, and Rosa comes Monday and Wednesday, and Seth Garrett lives 3 miles away and has standing instructions to check if he sees no smoke from the chimney before midday." He looked at her. She looked back at him with the complete patience of a woman who had been competent on her own terms for a very long time and knew it. "Go to Wichita," she said. "Say your piece about the Herefords. Come home. I will still be here with everything in the same condition it is when you leave, and James William will probably have learned something new to do with his mouth while you're gone." He went to Wichita in October and gave his talk to the Cattlemen's Association, and came home 4 days later to find that James William had, in fact, learned to pull himself upright using the rung of a chair, and was doing so with the triumphant expression of a person who has just made a significant discovery. The years turn the way they do when life has found its shape, not without change or difficulty, but with the particular settling quality of a thing that has been built right. The Hereford numbers increased, and the ranch's reputation grew with it, and the new southern parcel proved its value in the first summer and more so after. Seth Garrett married a woman named Priscilla who had come to Caldwell as a schoolteacher, and the Garretts built a house 1/2 mile from the Wallace Ranch boundary, which made them neighbors in the practical sense and friends in the real one. James William grew into a boy who was, as everyone had predicted, patient and observant and surprisingly funny when he chose to be, and who had his mother's precision and his father's deep, unhurried way of learning things. He began to follow Hugh around the ranch at an age that made Hugh feel that the whole of the place was somehow doubled in meaning, showing it to his son as though for the first time, which it was, and which made everything in it new again. When James William was 4, Rebecca told Hugh she was expecting again. She told him in the same way she had told him the first time in the morning at the kitchen table, and he looked at her with the same attention he had given her 4 years earlier, and she looked back at him with the same complicated mixture of hope and careful self-protection. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "Less than last time," she said. "I know what this is now, and I know you." "That last part," he said, "that's what matters." She reached across the table and touched his hand briefly, the light pressure of it saying what neither of them needed to say aloud. Their daughter arrived in October, red-faced and absolutely certain of her own importance, and Hugh held her in the first hours and felt again the same irreducible wonder he had felt holding James William, which he had somewhat doubted would be possible to repeat, and which turned out to be entirely repeatable. "Does she have a name?" Dr. Horton asked, making his notes. Hugh looked at Rebecca. Rebecca looked at the baby and then up at him with an expression that was entirely certain. "Eleanor," she said. "For my sister." Martin Fowler wept when they told him, in the letter that went with the next week's post, not heavily but with the direct, uncomplicated grief and gratitude of a man who had loved his wife and was glad to hear her name carried forward. He wrote back a long letter, 3 pages in his careful hand, about Eleanor and what she had been and what she had meant, and it was the most he had ever written about her, as though the naming had opened something that had been sealed. Eleanor Wallace grew up with her brother's patience, but not his quietness, talking from the moment she could string words together with a relentless, joyful thoroughness that filled the house with sound in a way that amused her father and delighted her mother. She was her Aunt Eleanor in miniature, Rebecca told Louise Deering when they were sitting on the Wallace porch in the summer of the child's second year, a leaner on Hugh's knee talking to him with great seriousness about a grasshopper she had found, and Hugh listening with the same absolute attention he gave to everything. "He treats everything she says as though it's worth hearing," Louise said. "He does," Rebecca said. "He's always been that way, with everyone." Louise looked at her friend. "He was that way with you, from the very beginning, you said." "He was," Rebecca said. She was watching her husband and her daughter in the afternoon light, the ranch spread out behind them, the grasses moving, the cattle on the far pasture, everything she had built in this place gathered around her in a way that was so complete it sometimes surprised her with its own weight. "You know," Louise said, "when Frank told me what had happened, that the bride hadn't come and you'd arrived instead, I thought you were going to stay 3 months and go back to Missouri." "So did I," Rebecca said. "What changed your mind?" Rebecca was quiet for a moment. "He drove me out to Martin's farm," she said. "And we didn't speak for a while, and the sky was extraordinary, and when I finally said so, he said it still affected him every morning. And I thought—" She stopped and looked at Hugh, who was now apparently being shown 2 grasshoppers, which a leaner had found a second one, and felt this was an occasion requiring immediate paternal attention. "I thought, that is a man who has not stopped noticing things. And I did not want to stop noticing things either, and I thought that might be enough to start with." Louise smiled. "Was it?" "It was more than enough," Rebecca said. "It was everything." Daniel Fowler came that September for a longer visit, 16 years old now and very tall, with a serious, methodical quality that had only deepened with time. He spent the week working with Hugh and asking questions about the horse management with the focused specificity of a young man who was planning something. On his last evening, sitting on the porch with the last of the summer light going, he told Hugh he had been reading everything he could find about horse breeding and intended to start a small breeding operation on the Fowler farm as soon as he had saved enough from his summer work to buy a decent mare. Hugh listened to all of it without interrupting, which was the only way to hear something properly, and then said, "I have a mare I've been thinking about selling. She's 5 years old and she's sound and she has a good temperament. I'll sell her to you at what she cost me 3 years ago." Daniel stared at him. "That's below what she's worth now." "Yes," Hugh said. "Why?" Hugh looked at him for a moment. "Because your aunt drove 2 days to Caldwell to explain to a stranger why his mail-order bride wasn't coming," he said. "And that stranger has not been able to find a way to properly repay the Fowler family ever since. Consider the mare a partial payment." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, the way he had been quiet at 10 years old watching the ceremony in the parlor, calculating the weight of what was being said. "Thank you," he said, and it was a man's word of gratitude, not a boy's, and Hugh accepted it as such. The evening of Daniel's departure, Rebecca sat at her writing desk and wrote him a letter to take with him. A proper letter full of practical advice about the breeding records he should keep and the questions he should ask when looking at a stud. And she added at the end, in her precise, clear hand, "I came west because you needed looking after and because I had nowhere else to be needed quite so specifically. I stay because I have found every kind of richness here that I did not know I was looking for. You and your sisters and your father are part of that richness. Never doubt it." She sealed the letter and gave it to Daniel in the morning, and he put it in his coat pocket next to his heart in a gesture that she noted and did not say anything about. And Hugh, watching from the fence where he was checking a latch, noted it too and said nothing. The autumn of that year, 1883, was warm and golden, and full of the particular abundance of a place that has been properly worked over several years. The south pasture was rich, and the cattle numbers were the best they had been, and the new portion of the fence line along the Harkins land was complete and solid, and the barn stood in good order against the first pale frosts. Hugh stood at the south fence one morning in October, the kind of morning that Kansas does better than anywhere else, with the light going long and pale gold across the grass, and the air sharp and clean, and the whole of the land visible for what seemed like forever. And he thought about the letter he had written to the matrimonial agency Incent, Louis 5.5 years ago, and the letter that had come back describing a 22-year-old woman from Springfield, and the woman who had actually stepped off the stage, older and quieter, with silver at her temples and steady hazel eyes, and a way of being present that had rearranged everything he thought he understood about what he was looking for. He thought about what he had said to Seth Garrett the day he had asked if Rebecca knew as much about cattle as she acted like she did, and what he had said back to Seth, which was that she knew more. He thought about what he had said to Martin Fowler on his wedding day, about being impressed rather than intimidated, which was true in ways that had only grown truer with time. He thought about his son, who was currently inside being read to by his mother before school, and his daughter, who was at the Deering farm with Louise and her children, and the ranch around him that was not just his ranch anymore but their ranch, built together out of years and decisions, and honest conversation, and the specific, enduring quality of two people who had looked at each other clearly from the beginning and chosen what they saw. He heard the door of the house and turned, and Rebecca was coming across the yard toward him with James William at her heels, because he had apparently decided school could wait a minute. And she had a cup of coffee in each hand, and her hair was still not entirely pinned, and the morning light was on her face, and she was looking at him with the same direct, comfortable attention that had, in a hotel sitting room in April of 1878, made him feel that the ground had shifted. She came to the fence and handed him his cup and looked out at the pasture with him, and James William pressed himself between them at the fence rail with the proprietary comfort of a child who knows his place in the world. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. "What are you thinking about?" He looked at her, at the silver at her temples that was whiter now and entirely beautiful, and the steadiness in her face that had not changed at all, and the warm, solid fact of her beside him at his fence in his field in this morning in this life. "I was thinking about a letter," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "A letter that was very wrong about almost everything it promised," he said, "and more right than it knew." She looked at him for a moment, and something moved in her face that was quiet and deep and entirely his to read after 5 years of careful reading. "That letter did more good than the person who wrote it intended," she said. "It did," he said, "though I have to say the wrong version was considerably better than the right one would have been." She turned to look at him fully, and her expression was the wide, genuine smile, the one he had earned slowly and which still felt like a specific reward. "I hope you tell people that," she said, "when they ask." "I tell everyone," he said, which was true, because he had said it to Seth Garrett and to Frank Deering and to Daniel Fowler, and to Augusta Cole, the land agent, when they had met again at the Wichita Cattle Conference, and he would go on saying it for the rest of his life, because it was the truest thing he knew. James William, who had been listening with the focused patience of a child who understood that adult conversation had content worth attending to, looked up at his mother and then at his father and said, with the complete seriousness of a 6-year-old, "What letter?" Hugh and Rebecca looked at each other over their son's head, and Hugh said, "We'll tell you that story properly when you're older." "When will I be older?" "Soon enough," Rebecca said, and ruffled his hair, and James William made a sound of protest and straightened it himself, and they stood at the fence in the October morning with the gold light on the grass and the prairie going forever around them, and the coffee was hot and the air was clean, and the cattle were on the far pasture doing exactly what cattle do, and everything was exactly, precisely, completely right. That evening, after the children were in bed, Hugh built up the fire in the south room and Rebecca sat in her chair with the letter she was answering, one from Clara Morrison, who now had 3 children in Springfield and still wrote with the same rounded, earnest hand, and one from Martin Fowler with the news that Daniel had sold his first foal and had put down the money on a second mare, and was building toward the thing he had decided at 11 years old to build. Hugh sat across from her and read, and the fire moved, and outside the prairie was very dark and very full of stars, and the coyotes called somewhere far off across the grass, and the house held them, warm and solid and full of the particular silence of two people who have found the one place where silence is entirely enough. Rebecca looked up from her letter after a while and found Hugh watching her, which he often was, and she met his eyes with the same steadiness she had met them with across the sitting room of the Caldwell Hotel, and the expression she wore was everything she had arrived without and built with him in this place over 5 years of mornings and work and honest conversation and careful, complete love. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Just you." She held his gaze for a moment, and in the firelight her face was warm and clear and entirely at home, and she said, "Just me," the same way he had said it, not dismissing it but accepting it, the way you accept something you know is the whole of the world. She went back to her letter. He went back to his book. The fire moved. Outside, the stars of Kansas were extraordinary.